70th Annual American Association of Community and Junior Colleges Convention, held April 22nd through the 25th, 1990, in Seattle, Washington.
I'm not going to say anything about the session being at 8:30 in the morning because, frankly, I suspect that most of us, when we go back to work, are going to be already hard at work in our offices by 8:30 in the morning. I think, however, you may find this something of a reward for girding your loins and getting here in the rain for the first session in the morning. We have, by way of something of a treat for you, we're going to have conversation with a pair of gentlemen who have been looking into the present status and the future possibilities for community college education into the next century. I don't have to say anything to you about the potential for community colleges and the mission and the clientele. This would be preaching to the choir. There's no point in telling you that we think it's a very good idea to be in community college education. I think I'll just start by introducing the gentlemen who are here and sit back and let her rip. I have two people here this morning to talk with you, Bob Templin and Stephen Zwirling. Bob is president of Thomas Nelson Community College in Hampton, Virginia. He has his doctorate from North Carolina State University. He has his master's from Georgetown. He has his BA from Towson State. And he is a community college graduate from Harvard Community College in Bel Air, Maryland. Before Bob was at Thomas Nelson, he was for 12 years Dean of Instruction under George Vaughn in Charlottesville, Virginia, at Piedmont, Virginia Community College. He has published a number of articles. He is currently working on 3 more, and if we're very good, maybe we can get him to talk about the sort of work he's interested in now. And one of the articles he wrote was republished in the AACJC Journal last year as the award-winning article for the year for some research that he did with George Vaughn on value-added education, a particular piece of research that they carried on in Charlottesville. On my left, if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce them both because I have such good time at these things, I forget what's going on. I sometimes forget to take care of housekeeping chores. I'm going to introduce them both at the same time. This is Bob Templin. This is Stephen Zwirling on my left. Stephen, I think you will find a delight. These are both wonderful people to listen to. Stephen comes from New York. Stephen is a New Yorker, born and raised, right? He is currently Associate Dean of NYU School of Continuing Education. In effect, he is president of their community college at NYU. Before that, he was director of the Staten Island Community College Division of Experimenting with Special Programs. All of that in capital letters. I take it from his own letter. He grew up in Brooklyn. He went to Columbia College. He went on for graduate work in English and Comparative Lit at Columbia and Rutgers. He has published a number of articles and books, among which those of you who've heard of Stephen will remember is Second Best. He's come up with another book in 1986 called The Community College and Its Critics. He's had a number of articles come off that since. And in addition to working at NYU, he is also a consultant with the Ford Foundation's community college programs. He will be administering Ford's new community college leadership development programs starting in the very near future. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Bob Templin and Stephen Zwirling. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming out on a rainy day. Nothing so unusual, I guess, at Seattle, but the last morning of the conference, you all get gold stars for that. When we met for drinks yesterday evening, we rehearsed a little bit about what we would do this morning, and Bob said to me, he said, "Don't be too reasonable." And I'll try not to disappoint him.
They didn't come to hear that.
Right, I'll try to be a little bit unreasonable. I didn't prepare anything formal to read to you, so if it's all right with you, what I'd rather do is talk about a couple of things. One, how I came to be a critic, in quotes, of community colleges, and what were some of the themes, in effect, that emerged in my thinking about community colleges in the process of becoming a critic. Not so much to talk about myself, but rather to talk with you a little bit and try to engender some discussion about themes that still concern me, critical themes that still concern me, and critical colleagues who write and talk and think, quotes, critically about the community college movement. Because it seems to me, in thinking about what to say today, that quite a few of the things that concerned critics 20 years ago are still of concern, or in my view should be of concern, to those of us who try on a daily basis to work effectively with the kinds of students who come to our institutions. I was working, as Lynn mentioned, at Staten Island Community College for an inspired and somewhat crazy educator who was the president of the college, William Birnbaum. Some of you may have heard of Bill Birnbaum and his work, and he in many ways was my mentor and provided me with an extraordinary opportunity to do many, many things at a time when Staten Island Community College and many community colleges around the country were experiencing unprecedented growth and had the opportunity to add faculty and programs. It was great society days, and we all, those of us who are old enough to remember, recall how luxurious that all seemed, particularly now when we contemplate enrollment increases but budget decreases. So at SICC, we were encouraged by Bill to do all kinds of crazy and wonderful things. Of course, being 20 years younger at the time didn't hurt a bit. While working at SICC, as Lynn mentioned, though I was an administrator and I ran the open admissions program there, and I was the dean of their evening program and then the head of Staten Island's experimental division, place where we attempted to launch all kinds of programs for returning women and Vietnam vets and ex-offenders and outreach programs, storefront programs, things of that sort, the sort of thing that everybody was doing back in the late 60s and early 70s. My background was in English and comparative literature, and I really knew nothing, to be honest with you, either about administration or about education for that matter. But I muddled along, I guess, the way a lot of academic administrators did, learning by doing. Learning, it was really on-the-job training without a lot of training, just a lot of doing and a lot of trying. We all have lots of anecdotes, and one that really sticks in my mind that helped direct me toward sort of the development of a critical approach was encountering a student named Julia Lara. She was an 18-year-old young woman from the Dominican Republic who I met one day, and in getting to know her, she had a profound influence on my life as an educator. Julia was in the college's medical lab technology program. For those of you who don't know what a medical lab technology program is, it's a program, a career program that was designed to lead people toward jobs in medical labs. I'm getting to know Julia, I began to wonder why in God's name was she's black, a woman from the Dominican Republic, as I mentioned, is relevant to the story. I began to wonder why in God's name was Julia in this program, leading to, in my view, a very, very limited career. She told me that, as I got to know her, that it was largely as the result of what I later put words to, these kinds of words, to sort of tracking experiences and channeling experiences that she encountered first in junior high school, then in high school, and ultimately at our own college, where when she met with her college advisor during her first encounter, during her first time at the college, and he asked her, Julia, what do you want to do? She said, I want to go to medical school. So he took out her file and he said, Julia, that's a noble aspiration, but you really have to be realistic. You're a woman, you're black. When I look at your test scores and your high school average, I realize that you were really not likely to be successful in a pre-med program. Why don't you go into the medical lab technology program? There you'll be able to work with doctors in hospital settings and laboratory settings. You'll be in the medical field. And so she thought that was good advice and proceeded. I don't have enough time to tell you the whole Julia Lara story, except to say that with some colleagues, we felt that Julia and many other students that we were meeting at that time, and again, I confess a great deal of personal ignorance about all of this at that time, we recognized that something had gone amiss. And we stumbled into a method of working with Julia and other young people at the college that I still feel was extraordinarily effective. And through the years, we worked literally with hundreds and hundreds of people, and they have achieved some of the most remarkable things. Cut to the current bottom line. Julia is a physician. She transferred to Yale University through a special program that we developed with Yale University, many steps along the way. But in thinking about Julia and working with her during those years, I felt that I too needed to become more educated about what my institution was about and why there were so many Julias on my campus, and through the years discovered that there were many, many, many who unfortunately did not do nearly as well. So where did I go with this? And well, the first thing I did was began to read some histories of higher education, particularly focusing on how community colleges emerged. And frankly, I was stunned to learn in looking at that early history of community colleges that they really did not emerge as institutions to democratize higher education. In my reading of the history, they came into being for totally opposite reasons. In fact, they went through their greatest growth and transformation during those years when millions, literally millions of students were realizing that they needed more than a high school education, and community colleges were proposed and pushed, frankly, by this organization as well as the AAJC, called it the AAJC at the time, were pushed as those institutions to which students should be diverted in order to keep the four-year colleges and universities from being overrun by, in effect, hordes of students who would, in fact, either diminish the academic standards of those institutions or push too many people through to baccalaureate degrees and beyond and overload the existing occupational structure of the country. The early leaders of the community college movement, including the founders of this organization, as well as state planners who devised plans for master plans for higher education for their states in California and Florida and New York, etc., unabashedly through the 1940s and 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s talked in their master plans about this role for community colleges. And so, as an emerging critic of community colleges, the first thing I, quotes, discovered was the, quotes, real history of the American community college. Next, since it seemed to me that in working with the Julias of the world, that not only what we did in the classrooms was critically important, I began to feel that what we did in our counseling and advisement and our non-classroom work with Julia was really even more important. And so I began to look at the literature on counseling and advising. And frankly, I was horrified to discover when I read the Burton Clarks, etc., who wrote about what counseling at community colleges should be about, and he wrote about cooling out. I had never heard of the notion of cooling out until reading Burton Clark's article, The Cooling Out Function of the Community College, in which he described this kind of gentle, I feel, manipulative process by which counselors and advisors and faculty members attempt to get the Julia Laras of the world to, quotes, be realistic, to recognize that their academic ability and their academic aspirations were unrealistic, and they needed to be sort of cooled out into accepting sort of lower, lesser aspirations for themselves. And when I looked around at my college, and I'm sort of speaking in a sort of microcosmic way, and in later years looked beyond that, I saw this going on. And frankly, it horrified me, because it seemed to me that although it is appropriate to help people who really are struggling and are not willing to work hard, and whose aspirations are indeed unrealistic, to help them recognize that. But I didn't sense the opposite going on. I didn't sense any agenda for heating up, for discovering the hidden potential in people and encouraging its flowering. I didn't sense a lot of that going on. What I sensed at that time was an awful lot of diverting, an awful lot of movement toward diminish the aspirations of students. Reading further through the 60s and 70s, I came upon some stuff written by Jerome Carabel and others who talked about heavier duty kinds of things, issues of social stratification and tracking within schooling as a means to, in effect, protect the existing social structure of the society. And in reading further and in beginning to now do my own research and now just beginning to write about community colleges and abandoning my work in Old English, Beowulf, and things of that sort, long and sadly forgotten at this point, it became apparent that not only was there a great deal of diverting and tracking within schools, directing, in my view, more and more inappropriately substantial percentages of students to institutions that were really not set up to serve their best interests, that there was a considerable amount of tracking going on within community colleges as well. At that time, the more affluent, whiter students tracked into the academic transfer programs, and the, quote, less able, more minority students tracked into lower status vocational programs. And even within the vocational programs themselves, there seemed to be distinct tracking that was based more upon race and socioeconomic status than upon students' real interest or academic ability. I began to read people like Alexander Aston, Sandy Aston, and others who talked about how community colleges not only admitted the lowest academically achieving students, but were admitting many students, a substantial percentage of students, who were capable, if they wished to, by the standards of the times, go directly to a four-year college. And so there was a substantial, perhaps 20% of the student body at community colleges who began at community colleges were, on the basis of high school average, SAT scores, however you wanted to measure academic achievement, eligible for admissions to four-year colleges, but chose instead, for one reason or another, to begin their college education at community colleges. He and others discovered that these academically and socioeconomically equivalent students who began at a two-year college versus a four-year college were at a substantial disadvantage, that they were substantially less likely to complete their academic course of study than students who began at four-year institutions. So he and others, and I began to feel through my own research and writing, began to feel that there was something in the very nature of the community college that thwarted the academic achievement of a substantial number of the students. Admitting that many others succeeded, but nonetheless, it began to seem to me not enough who should be succeeding were in fact succeeding. It wasn't until later years that I became interested in some of the cultural studies about community college. For example, Howard London's very interesting book called The Culture of a Community College, the writings of Richard Richardson, particularly his work on the open access college. And they began to look at, and I in recent years have been looking myself more closely at, cultural issues that in fact seem to permeate two-year colleges and substantially distinguish them from four-year colleges and universities. For example, Richardson and others write about how there is a diminished academic climate in community colleges. He calls it leveling down, in which faculty and students, in effect, conspire together to demand less academically, to emphasize more the acquisition of bits of information and their repetition primarily on short answer tests than helping students aspire to acquire higher level cognitive skills, the kinds of skills that four-year colleges and universities emphasize and community colleges in fact de-emphasize. I call this the remedialization of the community college, and it's my view that this is a problem that we currently face, that we have in effect leveled down the academic expectations for our students to the point where our colleges, our institutions are becoming virtually vocational training institutions in which remediation has taken the place of of heightened academic demands. I should stop. There are more things along the way that I looked at as a critic and still identify as major themes for us to confront, I feel necessary to confront, if we're to try to be more effective in working with the kinds of students who come to us. I hope that perhaps in the discussion with Bob and with you and with Lynn, that there'll be some opportunity to talk about this in slightly more detail, and also talk about some things that we as educators can do in this sort of critical context to work more effectively with faculty and students so that we can help our students achieve the goals that I feel they're capable of achieving. Let me pass this.
This is, to some extent, the view of we have met the enemy, and they is in large part us, right? In the other corner, we have charity begins at home, things better done at home, and I give you Bob Templin.
Steve, the problem with your analysis, and those of many people that you've outlined, is that you describe a portion of what's going on, and the press and others who grab at that, and some policymakers, define that as the whole. And we don't have enough scholars who are describing perhaps the general experience, and instead they're describing the exceptional experience. And we're generalizing to what we do. I would maintain that as a, in part, consequence to that, we end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy that tends to make many in community colleges who are struggling for an identity of quality, who somehow in their souls feel that what they're doing is the right thing, but somewhat unsure about it, that these notions reinforce the notion of second best and become self-fulfilling prophecies. I suggest that there are other areas of describing community college reality that are equally valuable, but for some reason have escaped an awful lot of university research attention. And in particular, I'm concerned about the growth of a notion that Jerome Karabel and his co-author recently have developed in The Diverted Dream, the notion that structural sociologists or conflict theorists have that there is actually a conspiracy being created in society to keep people from gaining access to power, to wealth, to status in society. And that this conspiracy has actually been created in the form of the community college. And there's something that of this conspiracy theory that is ill-defined. So I see what we're doing here today is arguing a little bit about whether the glass is half empty or half full, indicating that perhaps we've dwelled on it being half empty too much of the time. And I'm going to concentrate on our successes rather than our weaknesses, because I think that we have overlooked many and have sold ourselves short on a number of things that are occurring. But because of this confusion of identity and comparison with what other standards are in higher education, we've confused our mission with traditional missions and compare ourselves to other institutions, selling ourselves short. So what I'm offering, all of us are dealing with issues of institutional effectiveness. And if we compare ourselves with traditional institutions on that matter, we could very likely turn up very short. But if we compare our work in relationship to our mission, we may find that not only are we doing an adequate job, but in many cases we're doing an outstanding job. And so George Vaughan and I developed a framework that was emerging out of the literature at the time over the debate over value-added education, of which Alexander Aston is also a leader. We developed that concept through some research, and I'd like to share some of those results. We believe that we can demonstrate through a value-added approach to institutional effectiveness that not only are our transfer students well prepared to continue their studies at a four-year institution, But because of the academic deficiencies that many of them bring, we actually help them overcome those deficiencies and travel a further distance in achieving the results than do our four-year counterparts. Alexander Aston defines value added for us very simply. He says, it's the difference between a student's performance or abilities upon leaving the institution and comparing that with what the skills were upon entry. Now, value added has been adopted by a number of four-year colleges. Northeast Missouri State University and Alverno in particular have been probably the most famous. But I think that this value-added concept has special appeal to community colleges, particularly since we have many less prepared students with us. I'm going to skip through the presentation that I prepared to go into that into some detail and just indicate that there are others that have noticed that the community college is serving a very distinctive function amongst students that are able to perform after leaving the community college equal to or better than the native students, and that these same students, unlike Sandy Aston's findings, not only were not capable of being admitted, but had it not been for the community college experience, probably could not have performed at the same level that they do. David Reisman writes about this group of community college students as the community college elite. And he did some studies of this community college elite and found that the students unanimously agreed that their community college experience was the key to their success. The dominant value that the community college added to them, said David Reisman, was self-confidence. As one student observed, quote, you have to feel that you can do something when you start college, and the community college gives you that feeling, end of quote. David Reisman gives credence to the notion of value added when he said, quote, there is no denying that members of the community college elite are both unique and talented individuals, but to explain their apparent success at senior institutions as merely the result of their innate talents is to discount the validity of their own perceptions and to be unfair to their respective community colleges. Well, George and I took a look at 500 community college transfer students, not that went to the average state university, but in Virginia taking a look at the most elite of our institutions. And in Virginia, that's the University of Virginia. We looked at 500 community college transfer students, and we compared them with the performance of native students. And our research indicated that, which has been done many times before, that the students that went there tended to do as well or slightly better as the native student. And so that was not really a new finding. But I'd like to share with you what those comparisons were. At the end of the junior year, these 500 students, the transfer students, had an average of a 3.0 average compared to a 2.97 average of the native student. Statistically, probably not a significant difference. After 2 years of transferring, the cumulative grade point average was 3.15 for the community college transfer student compared to 3.09 for the UVA native student. 79% of the transfers completed their degree within 2 years, and that compared with 86% of the native university students. Of those students that didn't complete within 2 years, they completed for some reason other than academic performance because they had an average, grade point average of a C+. So they were in good standing at the university, but for some other reason they took a longer period or didn't complete. Now these results are strikingly similar to other transfer studies that have been done. But what we did was a little bit different. We went beyond. We took a look at the academic characteristics of these transfer students when they entered the community college. And we took a look at the academic characteristics of the four-year university students when they had entered. And we found very startling differences there. 78% of the native UVA students had ranked in the top 20% of their graduating high school classes. Only 36% of the community college students had, a difference between 78% and 36%. Perhaps the most striking difference was that 22% of the community college students ranked in the 5th decile or below, whereas the native students, only 4% of UVA students had been in the 50th percentile or lower. The composite score for SATs between the UVA native student and the community college transfer was 180 points lower for the transfer student than the UVA native student. 20% of the transfer students that we studied had been denied admission previously to the university based on low GPAs in high school rank, and SAT. And yet these were the same students who performed better or are the same as the native students after attending the community college. 26% of these students had to enroll in remedial classes at the community college. 2/3 of the students that we saw were female, including and indicating to us for some reason that women in particular were disproportionately benefiting from the collegiate experience at the community college. And the average age of our transfer student was almost 27 years old compared to a 20-year-old junior at the University of Virginia. For the older student then, we were finding that the community college was serving a disproportionate function. We believe that as a result of this, the community college experience showed that community college transfers travel a greater distance on their collegiate journey than their university counterparts, and that somewhere along the way these students have overcome great difficulties, low test scores, and that they performed well not only at the community college but after transferring to the university. Now, we suggest that this achievement is due in part to the community college experience. And had it not been for the community college, a significant number of these students not only would have been denied admission, but the university and our society would have lost not mediocre talent, but outstanding talent that used the community college as access. We believe that in taking a look at our function and how well we're doing, that we should include this group of students in our definition of quality. And it's in addition to taking a look at perhaps areas where we're weak, where we need to be strengthened. I'll point to another example of what I'm showing, and this was pointed out to me yesterday. The University of Michigan just recently completed a study of community college transfer students, and their conclusion was that, in effect, few community college students with poor academic and economic backgrounds transfer to four-year institutions to earn baccalaureate degrees, and that those who do benefit from being at a community college could have gone on to the four-year colleges anyway. Well, probably one of the problems is that they didn't study the group that I and George found by looking at the students who were at the universities. Rather, they tracked a cohort of recent high school graduates and followed them without coming back after a period to look at the older student or the part-time student or the non-degree-seeking student and to follow the history of that particular group. As a consequence, it reinforces the stereotypic notion that community colleges provide an illusionary experience to diffuse their aspirations, to cool them out, and that is pervasive throughout the community college as kind of a structured inequality in society, a conspiracy to keep the poor in their place. So we have to describe the glass in its totality, not by dwelling solely upon the deficiencies that are there.
We've taken our first cut at what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right. And we're going to spend some time a little later on this morning on how we can do what we do better. Back to you.
I do agree with Bob that we need to look at the entire glass. We'll stay with this glass half full, half empty image. It's my view that we've spent, frankly, if you look at the full shelf of publications about community colleges, at least 80% of it focuses on those people who look at the part of the glass that's full. It's replete with literature by community college boosters and people who, in fact, are community college insiders who have, to say the least, a vested interest in seeing only that part of the glass that's half full. And frankly, to disparage and to create a dichotomy between, quotes, university researchers and community college researchers, in my view, is totally invalid and even a little prejudicial, because it implies that people in universities who look at community colleges really don't know them, really don't care about them, sitting in sort of endowed chairs in elitist contexts with graduate assistants running around doing work for them. And for those of us who are in the trenches at community colleges and attempting to run programs the way I am, even though I am at a university, in effect, are somehow really have our hands on the pulse of things. I mean, I frankly, I'm just as fed up as Dale Parnell. He's always quoted whenever a new study comes out, and the study that you referred to by Virginia Lee at the University of Michigan. As a matter of fact, I would recommend reading the entire study because it doesn't do, in fact, what you claim. And it's a fairly devastating piece of analysis and tracks students over a number of decades, as a matter of fact, and so looks at adult students as well as traditional age students. And in fact, that study does indicate that community colleges are succeeding most with students who are most likely to succeed even if they hadn't gone to community colleges. And I would suggest that even one could look at the studies that you and George did and say that although, yes, it's true that X%, a quarter of the students did do some remediation when at the community college, 3/4 didn't, and that is hardly a typical community college profile. In many places, particularly urban community colleges, 80–90% of the students do remediation. I'd recommend another study that you might want to undertake in your system. I would recommend taking a look at 500 students who entered your community college who, if they had in fact wanted to, could have entered directly into a four-year college because they had the high school averages, etc., to be admissible. Not the University of Virginia necessarily, but a four-year college, who did not succeed, in other words, who in effect left community college before even graduating, much less transferring, before completing programs, and do an analysis of what happened to them. And I would suspect that you would discover that a substantial percentage of them would not be so positive about what they had encountered, and in fact encountered a great deal of indifference, a great deal of alienation, a curriculum that was in total disarray, a faculty in many cases that taught and ran, who were dispirited and demoralized after years and years of teaching underprepared students, and who, in effect, were teaching in a way that Dick Richardson and his colleagues identify. In addition, I really want to say something about this conspiracy notion. I will confess that in earlier years, I was persuaded that there wasn't really a conspiracy, but in fact, if one read the master plans for higher education in California, and I read all of them carefully and studied them all, and studied that system quite carefully, that if there wasn't a conspiracy, there was certainly a conscious attempt on the part of policymakers in the largest system in our country, which is in fact became the model for most states, to in fact stratify students throughout the three tiers of the system in a very, very conscious way. I mean, it still is a stratified system with junior colleges or community colleges at the bottom, state colleges in the middle, and the university centers as elite institutions. And there still is language in the current California master plan that talks about ways of encouraging students to enter junior colleges, even though the very people who make that encouragement realize that if you look at the success rate of community college students in California, that fewer than 10% ever transfer who enter via the junior colleges. So it's my view that we need to, if we're to be effective, not just sort of lob shells at each other across the line between community colleges and universities and those who see the glass as half empty or predominantly half empty or predominantly half full. I think that we have to look at programs that work, and undoubtedly what you've described occurred at your college was a program that was working, and I think that people could learn from it. But we also, I feel, need to embrace the mission of not just pointing to how effective we are at working with some of the better students who are at our institution, but since community colleges are becoming racially and socioeconomically even more stratified than in previous years, with now the majority of minority students entering college via community colleges, and the success rate among minorities is woefully inadequate, that as our mission for the 90s, it's my view that we should, in fact, embrace it as our unique mission, what our rhetoric has always said we're about. That is, the college to be colleges of opportunity for the Hulialaras of the world, and to do everything we possibly can to uncover, discover, and work with those students as intensively and as effectively as we seem to be working with the group that come out of the come to us with stronger academic backgrounds.
All right, Bob, you can take this line down.
I think that we have to yield a little to some of your observations, Stephen. But I think there are some encouraging signs, even as you paint a portrait that there is so much work to be done. I think there are some encouraging signs on the picture that you paint. For instance, as Carabelle and Brent had, in their book, The Diverted Dream, had talked about the vocationalization of the community college as part of this tracking and cooling out. The publication couldn't be more timely, I think, because suddenly there's a resurgence of interest in and students enrolling in community college transfer programs. And many of these students, as you've recognized yourself, are increasingly diverse, bringing a wide variety of backgrounds. Nationally, or at least in the Southeast, I'm familiar with community college transfer enrollments in being the fastest growing part of community college enrollment. 14 to 20% increases in enrollment in college transfer. At my institution, over the past 4 years, it's almost doubled. And that's very, very encouraging. Secondly, minority enrollments are up, higher than ever before, with greater numbers coming to the community college. And that was a trend that's been reversed because, as you know, minority enrollments have been declining. Even enrollments among black males is up, which was just incredible, though black female enrollment is up even better, much better. Hispanic enrollment is increasing at a rate much faster than the white enrollment. So I think those are encouraging signs.
That's encouraging, but in my view, it would only be encouraging if we knew what to do with those students, in effect. It would be a little... that unless we can figure out how to work more effectively with the kinds of students who are, once again, in effect, coming to us, that there will be even more disappointment. There'll be even more grounds for criticism. And I think, in fact, that some of the revived interest in transfer is part of a larger sort of social phenomenon, obviously, in which there are more enrollments in liberal arts and four-year colleges and universities than there have been in the previous decade. But I think also to sort of tip the hat a bit to some of the critics of the community college movement. For years, they, and I'll include myself in this, have been decrying the de-emphasis on transfer and the tremendous infusion of commitment and energy and resources to the vocational programs. And there have been critics of their effectiveness as well, as you know. So I think that some of the foundations, Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, and others, have been getting behind programs to encourage the improvement of the transfer collegiate function of the community college, and that this is a good example, in my view, of how one sort of needs to listen to all voices. It's perfectly okay if one disagrees with everything that I've had to say, or for that matter, everything that you've had to say. But I think it's terribly important that I listen to you and you listen to me, and I know I listen to you and you know that, and I know you listen to me and I know that as well. I've learned from you, and I sense that you've learned a little bit from me as well. I feel that we'll be better practitioners if we look at what works and take an honest look at what doesn't work. And not to just say, well, it's the decline of the family structure or the decline of literacy or the television is destroying the minds of the young and the culture of poverty, etc. All true. But in the meantime, they come to us in even greater numbers, thank God. And can we learn from what you've done and from what other people have done effectively, in my view, often set in a critical context of awareness of what will go wrong unless we pay attention, more attention to some of the kinds of things that haven't worked in the past.
Whoops. Bob.
Well, I agree. I think the value of criticism is that it causes us to re-examine some basic assumptions that we have in light of new information. And some of that new information that I find particularly encouraging, without conceding to some of the criticism, is that the criticism over the over-vocationalization of the community college now has an interesting twist, and that is that these students who have been tracked or channeled surprisingly fool everybody and become transfer students anyway. And they're succeeding in greater numbers. I know that in several states that I've been watching, their numbers, at least over the past few years, have equaled those of those who said that they were intending to go as transfer students, and they're doing very well. The critical factor in their success that I'm finding is that they have to complete a substantial portion of their collegiate experience at the community college. And having done that, if they can complete 30 hours of work at a community college with a respectable point average, regardless of the program that they're in, they end up being successful. Now, I don't know quite what to attribute that to, but I'm encouraged to see even students, for whatever reason, whether we cool them out or they're counseled or their aspirations are lowered, somehow they don't give up, and they're going on and they're transferring. Another thing that I'm encouraged to see is that I see some colleagues from North Carolina State University here, and as they know, we've been doing some research on community college students since Ben, I guess it was 1969, and Gerald Bullock first did it. And every 5 years, we've been looking at the students. And, Stephen, we've been watching tracking, and it is going on. I mean, I can't tell you that counselors or faculty, but there has been an incidence of the higher the socioeconomic status of the student, the greater likelihood the student will be in college transfer. And the lower the occupation of the head of household, the greater likelihood to be in vocational programs. But what's very interesting is that this last group that we did in 1989, that's become more diffuse than ever, that it's beginning to break down, that those traditional demarcations or stratification that was there now is becoming more blurred. And I think that that's very encouraging as well.
All right. Stephen, you want another crack at it?
Well, I think I'm watching the clock, and you're in charge, and maybe there are some people who want to dice it up here a bit. We're in danger now of starting to be mealy-mouthed a little bit. I mean, so we have to keep our edges sharp, and so let's get some other voices. I think you're probably going to need to talk into this thing.
Yes, if I may, at least if you'll stand and give your name and school so I can repeat your question into the mic. Yes, sir.
Well, my name is Don Dole from Green Community College in New York. I guess I am not ashamed of the fact that we have gone in the vocational direction. I have a board member who's on board of trustees who has a degree from junior institution. He's the president and CEO of New York State Gas and Electric. And he takes great offense to the fact that somehow he could not be complete in life without bachelor's degree. I think there is this elitism, which is sending another message to a lot of students at our institution who are in technical programs and health science programs. They feel like they have reached their dream, that step of it. When they get their nursing degree or dental hygiene degree or electrical technology degree. And I'm very concerned that we're overemphasizing the fact that everyone needs to transfer. I do not accept that as a valid criticism of community colleges. And I'm not sure, when we talk about the values, and when we do research, we must identify our own perspective. And what makes going out and getting a job after a bachelor's degree or a master's degree inherently better than getting a job after a 2-year degree? I don't know that I fully understand why one is inherently better.
All right. Comments to the fact that we're in danger of viewing the value of a college only in terms of the college transfer function and the subsequent gaining of a baccalaureate degree. Right. Gentlemen?
I am not advocating by any means that everyone get a bachelor's degree. As a matter of fact, I think that one of the things that made this country great were all the self-made people, the tinkerers and the Steve Jobs, however pronounces his name, who sort of worked in their garages, and the next thing we knew, a Model T came out or an Apple computer. So I believe that, in fact, some of our most successful people are people who didn't even have a grade school or high school education. As a matter of fact, I've been known to critique the overemphasis on credentials, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm concerned about is that we are in danger of frankly losing the potential of lots of people who are early on tracked toward, quotes, vocational programs only, who have both aspirations and abilities that are different, not necessarily better, but different, to do other things that require a college degree, and then some. Also, we were talking about this yesterday. The students, or the people, the young and people and the adults that we're not talking about at all are people who are out there on the street corners and are part of that huge army of permanently unemployable people. We tend not to talk about them at all at these kinds of sessions. In the old days, when my parents came to this country and grandparents came to this country, they could work their way out of poverty or provide for their family and a college education for a critter like me by working with their hands in blue-collar work in factories, etc. There isn't any more of that kind of work in this country, unfortunately, in my view. Entry-level positions even require the socialized skills that come from, sad to say, schooling of a certain sort. And so if we don't give at least equal emphasis to the acquisition of the skills of communication, of interpersonal skills, the skills that make people viable in a society that requires keyboard skills and service skills and interpersonal skills, etc., that don't come from training programs necessarily, but come from other kinds of work and very often will require bachelor's degrees and beyond. Unless we give equal weight to that, I think we're going to lose the contributions of many of our citizens. And so I'm not at all an advocate that everyone needs to transfer and get a bachelor's degree, because Bob is absolutely right. Virtually all of the old definitions that we apply to community colleges no longer exist. In fact, nationally, more people transfer from, quotes, terminal programs than from transfer programs. More people terminate from transfer programs than terminate from terminal programs. The functions of the college, in many institutions, there are more reverse transfers. People transferring in from 4-year colleges to 2-year colleges, then forward transfers. People moving from 2-year colleges. So all bets are off. All definitions are, in a sense, invalid. We need new terminology. We need new language, in effect, to describe what we do. We're using a lot of old language, and it in effect shapes our practice, because we are, and partly what you and I are talking about is a problem of language, because you heard me in a particular way, and I know I sounded that way because I don't have the right language yet, nor do you, I think, to sort of say what you're saying, because the language has changed so radically. So we need, not only, in my view, and these sessions at ASCJC have historically 70th year. If you look at the proceedings of the first 30 years of this organization, and I've had the displeasure to read all of them as part of my work in writing about the history of community colleges. The first 30 years of this organization, people agonized about a unique mission for the community college, the junior college as it was called. I think we better agonize right now again, because the old missions, in my view, do not include, we were talking about polarization in the society, and we kind of agreed last night that it's sort of like a tripolarization. And we don't talk at these meetings at all about the people that probably we should talk about most, the people who don't even come to us. And anyway, end of sermon.
Another question.
I'm Terry Thomas from State University. And Stephen, I certainly commend you for calling attention to the fact that there are a great many students who don't accept vocational programs or technical programs as being terminal, and it's a good idea to quit calling them that. But beyond that, in your analysis of college transfer students, and in your reading of other research, is it fair to say that most of the research ignores some of the factors that cause those people to start at community colleges rather than four-year universities, proximity to home, full-time jobs, and fails to take that into account in saying that some of the same factors may be impediments to graduating from a four-year program?
Question for Stephen as to whether a lot of the impeding factors that land people eventually not to finish their degree or their transfer function, either one, have to do with what made them community college entrants in the first place. Have we factored out what has to do with the college's responsibility and what comes from the outside factors?
Yeah, Terry, that's obviously the best argument against the studies that indicate that, quotes, academically and socioeconomically equivalent students, that's all in quotes, who begin at a two-year college versus begin at a four-year college seem to be at a competitive disadvantage if they begin at a community college. The best studies that I'm aware of have attempted to control for some of those variables, although I don't think there is a best study that, I think that's so extraordinarily complicated to attempt to do that it may be beyond our ability to do that. And so I'm prepared to sort of yield a little on that point. However, it seems to me that the most interesting studies in recent years talk about that concern in a different way, and in some cases don't even directly address it. But in my own mind, I'm beginning to sort of see linkages between some of the findings of cultural anthropologists like Lois Weiss at, again, a university researcher, forgive me, at SUNY Buffalo, and Howard London, who I mentioned already. Lois Weiss's book called Between Two Worlds, if you haven't read that, and most people in community colleges, for some reason, including me, until relatively recently, came upon that work. But people who talk about cultural issues, the kinds of cultural sets that students bring with them from their families and their neighborhoods to the community college, which has its own different culture, and the necessity for those students to find a way to successfully negotiate, in Lois's metaphor, the two worlds, the world of the family and the neighborhood and the world of the college. I think that those folks are getting closer to, in my view, some of the critical issues that impede the success of some of the kinds of students that I, frankly, want us to turn more attention to, immodestly want us to turn more attention to. We are not yet, in most colleges, even aware of that, much less developing counseling programs to directly deal with that. And my own guess is that if there are, in fact, some disadvantages to beginning at a community college, it's probably more in the cultural realm than in any of the other variables that the researchers to this point have attempted to address. So it's my view that if you would marry the work of Weiss in London and some others to the work of Aston and others who are sort of looking at the competitive disadvantage issues, I think that we would somehow begin to, one, understand what the problems are, if in fact there are problems. I, of course, feel that there are, and would help us develop programs to deal with some of those issues directly. As a matter of fact, plug in advance, I'm working on a book now with Howard London that attempts to look at the problems that first-generation students from, quotes, different cultures face when they move across the gulf that separates the two worlds. And this, half the book is about programs around the country that are attempting to deal with this, and in some cases, somewhat successfully.
A couple of comments, and then your question, sir. There is some research coming out of Oregon that uses Vince Tinto's model of attrition and applies it to community college students and adds another set of factors having to do with possible outside influences in terms of attrition. Needless to say, the results so far say not a great deal of significant difference, needs more study. We can't be surprised about that. Always needs more study. Right, more funding, another grant. The other comment that I wanted to make is that when we were chatting about our program yesterday, we all three came up with the findings that all of us are first-generation college people. We came from families that were very blue-collar. College was our ticket out. Now, Bob, did you want to talk? No?
It's just that we come full circle, and in my disagreement with Stephen, I agree. And that is that by our very success in creating a climate where they are finding more transfer students welcome, we're finding that in today's environment, the cost of higher education is making the community college and its transfer function more attractive to white middle-class young kids, Terry, who don't want to be at the community college. For the first time, out of any group in the community college that I've studied, these students are saying they would prefer to be somewhere else. Now, these students are bringing with them their home and their culture to the community college. And with their faculty, who tend to be an awful lot like them, and they're reinforcing each other and creating a climate that seems to be heating up and invigorating, but for that group. Not for the other group that's traditionally come to the community college, that's having difficulty making ends meet, whose home culture is very different than this culture that I'm talking about, and who find that themselves in the student union no longer feeling very comfortable. Because these kids driving up with eyes on Lacoste shirts in nice cars and talking about the universities they're going to transfer to don't hold much in common with them. And the culture of the community college now is becoming an unwelcoming place for the students that we were most meant to serve. I'm not saying that this must be. I'm saying this might be if we're not attentive to the issue of culture on the campus.
This is Bob's idea of not the cooling out, but the squeezing out function of the colleges.
Could I say one more word about it and why this is so, in my view, really important stuff to be thinking about and talking about, and also why it's maddeningly complicated. The people whose work in this realm I most respect not only talk about the difference in the culture of the home and the neighborhood and the college and how they come into conflict. I mean, I couldn't, until recently, understand why years ago a lot of my students at Staten Island Community College needed to buy two sets of books. One that and we had to provide lockers for them. One that they could leave on campus in lockers, and one that they would have at home because they couldn't go home carrying the books in the neighborhood. And I didn't understand that at all at the time. I understand it much better in recent years. But one of the maddening things about all of this that I think it's Weiss who really nails it for me, that there is a kind of, here are students who are coming to us. Obviously, they're coming because they want to learn, they want to better themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But since they're being pulled in a very opposite way at home and in the streets, they kind of, and since they struggle when they come to us, they create sort of a cool culture in which to succeed is not necessarily publicly valued. So that among their peers, if you saw the film about Jaime Escalante, Stand and Deliver, yeah, and about how the students publicly had to pretend that to succeed in college was somehow unmanly or uncool or what have you. And then they had this sort of private reality in which they were struggling to succeed. So they would bring to the cafeterias, the best, you're so right, I mean, if you go to the cafeterias at my favorite community college, Miami-Dade Community College, and all America's favorite community college, you see that so visibly. I mean, there are the kids in the Izod, Lacoste, and the leathers, and then in a smaller and smaller island in the cafeteria are the kids with less well-dressed. And this, you can just feel them being pushed into the corner and ultimately out, squeezed out, which is a wonderful way of describing it that you have. So it's maddeningly complicated because somehow or another, either we can sit there in bemusement and say, oh, look at that, isn't that fascinating, as anthropologists would, or if we have to roll up our sleeves and do something about it, what the hell are you going to do? Well, one, I think you have to understand. Two, you then have to, in my view, get through faculty development and working with the advisors and the counselors, figure out ways to talk to the kids and the adults about that stuff directly and deal with it directly.
Yes, sir, you have been most patient.
Michael Sachs, Adelaide, Australia. Stephen, I heard you say that your industry requires above all students who have those broad transferable skills, high levels of communication, keyboarding skills, ability to solve problems, and so on and so forth. I agree with that, but you didn't go on to say that these are least acquired as you're doing a Bachelor of Arts degree. I think I heard you say that. Now, we would argue that in fact it has far more to do with the methodology and the practices, and that in fact those sorts of transferable skills, which we call enterprise skills, can be acquired in any program, and certainly in the vocational programs, and certainly do not require you to go and do a bachelor's. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Comment on whether a great deal of the more valuable job skills can be acquired, enterprise skills can be acquired on the job, do not require a baccalaureate. No, necessarily.
Or in your vocational colleges.
Or in the, yes, in the 2-year degrees, or even the 1-year vocational diplomas. Yeah.
My view is the best place to learn those kind of things is around the kitchen table. And looking at my own life, I think whatever of those skills I have, that's probably where I got them the best. But if you don't get them there, or they need reinforcement elsewhere or enhancement, okay, you probably heard me correctly, and I probably spoke a little too fast in response to the gentleman's question from SUNY. I was trying to sort of mush too many things together, I think, and spoke too quickly. It's my view that what you call enterprise skills, what I call transportable skills, that you can sort of take with you from job to job, from career to career, generic skills, are, in my view, acquirable, as I've indicated, anywhere, literally. But through schooling, in my view, they're best acquired through general education, liberal learning, which can, in fact, be and should, in my view, be a critical part of any good, quotes, vocational program. Because my view is that the most practical skills are the skills that one acquires through liberal arts. That's the old Beowulf person in me speaking.
English major.
English major. Oh, God, we're boring. And so self-satisfied also, right? Anyway, so that's kind of what I really meant to say, but I was also trying to say simultaneously that for many people, we should be looking to sort of heat them up and encourage them to think about getting baccalaureate degrees. Not all, but many, for those people who have aspirations, career aspirations, and personal aspirations that require at least a baccalaureate degree, and that we shouldn't say, well, wait a minute, you can do just as well, make just as much money, be just as fulfilled a person if you never went to college at all or just went to a vocational program.
If we're careful not to be too patronizing about it. Questions from the back from everybody's favorite community college, Miami-Dade.
I'd just like to make a comment that as more institutions get involved in it, first, I believe economic development is being able to sell the liberal arts, very consistent with what you're saying. Second thing is I think it's very healthy that we do focus on institutional mission. The number of community colleges that I've studied that are getting into the Job Training Partnership Act type programs are serving clientele that they've never accepted. Despite our rhetoric of access, we've never really served community colleges to the degree we could. And there is institutional resistance from serving that in several schools that I studied on the part of regular faculty. And I would say also, we do need to look at our missions to see if training or work for literacy is part of the community college mission. I think it makes a lot of sense to examine it, and I thank the respondents and panel for doing this.
Very good. I am from a community college in North Carolina, and it has been set as one of our major goals in North Carolina that the community colleges should take a greater role in helping the literacy program. In our state also, we are mandated to give the GED degrees. They're given through the community colleges in North Carolina, but literacy goes beyond the GED, adult basic education. There was a hand over. Yes, sir.
As much of what you said is one that I agree with. But on the other hand, to what extent, or have there been studies done on the extent to which four-year institutions need to be prepared to accept the transfer students to explain to somebody from the University of Rochester that in fact, Vietnam veterans didn't go to college. And they were educated by the community college.
Right.
Now, however, our students come back from the road complaining that they're treated like children. Because lawyers refer to students as kids. And if you saw in the group yesterday, they're not kids. They're mothers and fathers. And we recently proposed to a number of students that they drop the word transfer and adopt the word conquer, relocation.
Relocation. Interesting.
And they can't do it. They can't do it in a language they
Yeah.
in any other way.
Question as to whether there isn't a need, and is there anything we can do to help the point of view from the senior university, which of course is, if not age-old, has been around a long time, and possibly this would be a start in terms of the difference of terms, the idea of a relocation student rather than a transfer student. The onus of this, of course, is always on the accepting university, always on the accepting senior institution, and whether you can get it mandated statewide to have transfer. Those of you who read the local Seattle paper this morning, there was a big article about problems they're having in the state of Washington with there not being enough room for the transfer students. Understandably, they've capped enrollment at the University of Washington, and there is nowhere for these people to go. They have to keep raising grade points, and this is not necessarily good. Yes, ma'am. Not just Virginia. That the students from your school in Northern Illinois.
Went.
In other words, your school replicated the effects that Bob had shown up in Virginia. The same thing happened in Illinois from your community college. Your students did better than the native students at Northern Illinois. Stephen.
That, as Bob pointed out, it's great and it's true, and this has been true for a long time. I think that's what's particularly noteworthy about the value-added approach is that they went from a community college to the most selective public institution in the state and did very well. Most of the tracking of transferred students is just up one notch in the usually tripartite hierarchy from a community college to the lesser selective, less elite four-year institutions. My point back to you is the students who transfer do great. They have for a long time. What Bob points out is doing even better than great, in fact, and it's a great validation of their approach. My concern is about all the people who don't succeed. You know, in effect, what I'm saying is that it's variously estimated of the students who declare themselves to be interested in transfer, and here I go again about transfer again, right, that 20-25% of them maybe transfer. Of those 20 to 25%, 75% of those 20 to 25% do they get baccalaureates in 2 to 3 years and do at least as well as native students after an initial drop in grade point average during their first transferred semester. What about everybody else? That's why it was not so much in jest to Bob about study another 500. You know, ones who came in with strong academic backgrounds who would have been admitted to a four-year school if they had chosen to. And maybe it would speak to some extent to Terry's point about, you know, why they choose to come to community college and didn't succeed, didn't go on, what happened to them.
A responsible chair says that the sessions have to end on time because there will be another session using this room. However, a person who understands this is a whole lot of fun and you want to continue talking to these people would suggest that we move outside into the hall if you would like to come and chat with our speakers further about this. We'll have to do part 2 next year. Right. I thank you for coming.
How you doing?
Yeah, I thought you should come on up to Binghamton. You're not that far, Will.
Steve, Tom Church, I'm from Pittsburgh, and you come on campus and make presentations. I like to get up time.
Yes, I'm falling off the stage.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I like people to get my
I didn't bring one with me, but I'll say I left mine a while.
What'd you play? Very good. Thank you.
Very good for you.
I won't take your time now. I'm very proud of y'all.
Lynn, thank you. Thank you, Lynn. This is the best session I've been to. It's good.
Great possibility you might come down during next week.
Yeah. I know that. You told me that. I believed you, and I was here on faith that you knew what you were talking about. But now it's more than faith.
Believe what you do now, be honest here. Be honest.
No, but what I mean as a concept for the way to do things here, instead of slideshows. Yeah.
Think about it. Who else might? It would be great. But if you mentioned Mr. Ron and yeah, somebody start with a plane. Okay, very good. I keep back.
Running good. One of the few times we have some intellectual scholarly debate instead of a show and tell. Super. He's out there selling the tapes. I'm doing great, Gary. How you doing? Good, good. Well, just got business down there in the sunshine. Right me up in the mountains. That's what that's like. Yeah. Especially after the state there's been there for $2 million short. Well, we're going to be invited to I suggest that we change it so you might be able to real flat.
Yeah.
Because I think what's happening, we just had it back down. One of the things that came up with us, it's pretty much a very important at it for general, more global.
I've been about with North Carolina State, the academic area, and this is all getting you down someday. So,
I was there last June, I guess.
Yeah, right, and I missed it then.
Right. Yeah, and I'm hoping that before I plan to manage this program, not that I really wanted to, I was just doing a study of programs that existed, and I pointed to yours as one of the best programs in the country, and I'm trying to get tribulation to this really flexible position that he's got a lot of academics that compare students are capable of carrying it, not going on. Great job having that. He's going to get so look forward to
good to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Bob. I always appreciate I don't always agree with you, but I appreciate your even approach to scholarship. Yeah. This is the best forum, in my opinion. Motivation is about no question about it. Motivation is yeah, that's good. Well, they come in with an attitude that they can do it at the community college, just less than that.